Right. Well, Helen, thank you. And thank you for having us. And Spencer, thank you for joining me and us. And it's truly an honor to do this with my son. And as Helen outlined, Spencer and I were in a horrific accident. And it's important for everyone on the call here or in the presentation to know it's been 25 years. And Helen, thank you for acknowledging the fact it was very difficult for me to talk about it. We were in an automobile accident. I was driving the car. The whole family was in the car. My wife was in the passenger seat. Spencer was in the seat behind me. And Griffin, our youngest son, was in the car seat behind my wife. And, one of the difficult things about the story is I'm not positive what happened. There was reports of heavy crosswinds. There was reports of a pickup truck driving erratically on the interstate. To my best recollection, I believe I may have just dozed off, just nodded off for a second. And in doing so, I swerved to the right, overcorrected to the left, and lost control of the car, which then began to roll, not off the freeway, but down the freeway. And it was a horrific accident. I'll get into some details about that. And I think to set the premise, just for the context, it's been 25 years. We can talk about it now. You can ask us any questions. I was 33 years old at the time. Spencer was 7 years old, just a child. And we've been on quite a healing journey. I had a profound near-death out-of-body experience, and I've experienced post-death communication. I've had dreams and visions. And in many ways, I think maybe I'm the lucky one, and yet perhaps I'm the weaker one because I needed all that, while Spencer, as a child and even growing up, didn't have profound near-death or out-of-body experiences. He did have some interesting dreams, or a dream that we may get into. But I'm going to go back to the day of the accident to set the precedent, and I'll talk about my experience. Spencer will talk about his experience. We'll ping pong it back and forth. So you'll hear from, hey, an NDEer who had this happen, and then one that is not an NDEer who navigated this without the, mystical, spiritual experience of an NDE, and how we've come to common ground in the end.
Yeah.
But in the accident, as the car rolled and as that happened, I blacked out for most of that. But when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. And the first thing I heard was Spencer crying in the back seat behind me, a hysterical 7-year-old. My initial reaction was, I've got to get to my son. I've got to get to my son. And that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the floorboard or the seat. I couldn't tell. There was the rancid smell of gasoline. There was all the broken glass. And I was unaware of my injuries. And this may be interesting information. What had actually happened was both of my legs had been crushed. My left leg was eventually amputated above the knee. My back had been broken. My rib cage had been crushed. My lungs were collapsing. My right arm had almost been torn off, and then the seatbelt had cut through and ruptured all my insides. I wasn't aware of any of that. All I knew is my son was crying, and I needed to get to my son. But that's when I realized that no one else was crying. And I knew at the scene of the accident that Tamara, my wife, and that Griffin, my youngest son, were gone. I knew in that moment that they were deceased. They were killed instantly in the accident. And here I had this 7-year-old who's hysterical in the back seat that I can't get to. That may be the darkest hell a man could ever be in. I felt so helpless. And I remember attempting to calm Spencer down. And I was struggling to stay conscious. I was struggling to speak. But I was able to say to him, it's going to be okay. And yet, in doing that, I thought that's a lie. It's not okay. This is not okay. It was the chaos, the horror, the trauma. There aren't words for what I was experiencing, and really aren't words for what he was experiencing. But it was in that darkest moment when I'm saying it's going to be okay, and losing consciousness and thinking, "Wow, my last words to my son are a lie." That light came. Light came. I felt light, tangible light came and swirled around me, and almost felt as if it was comforting me in this horrible, horrible situation. It felt as if I was lifted above the accident scene, and suddenly there was no pain. I could breathe. I was okay. In fact, my thoughts were, how could I possibly be okay? What's happening here? And it felt as if I was held in this bubble of light, this light all around me. And then suddenly in that light, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, was there with me. And yet she was emphatic that she kept saying, "Jeff, you got to go back. You got to go back. You can't come. You've got to go back." And we literally had a conversation about if I stayed with her, Spencer would be orphaned. And we made a choice. Somehow she seemed to have the knowing that she was not coming back, but I was. And we made the choice that I would return back. And that's just the very tip of the iceberg of the near-death experience. I said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say. And then I found myself wandering about, if you will, or found my soul wandering about in a hospital. And I'll get more into that, but I'm going to turn it over to Spencer for a minute, because that's the adult father at 33 years of age at the time's experience. But Spencer, as a child, Spence, why don't you tell us what that was like for you, just to set the stage?
So, I think a traumatic event like this is something that no one can ever fully come to grips with. But for a 7-year-old, I think, it's just unfathomable. I mean, like my dad said, so my recollection was as we were driving down the road, I was just caught up in an epic Star Wars battle with my toys, and it was on the weekend of Easter, so the Easter Bunny had visited us, and I had plenty of toys to play with, and so I was just kind of caught up in that, and then I recalled, I don't know if I remember my dad swerving first, but I remember hearing my mom scream out, "Jeff," and then from then, the overcorrection, and I remember the car started spinning, and it spun 6 to 8 times. And I remember describing it as just being beat up by a professional boxer. That's kind of how I think the shock helped absorb a lot of the pain in the moment. But I just recalled kind of everything slowing down, and I describe it as kind of seeing colors, not necessarily in black and white, but black and red. And I even recall kind of seeing in slow motion some of my toys fly past my face. But as the car came to a halt, I remember just being in shock, just pure shock. And like I said, there's no way to come to grips with it. But at that moment in time, that was by far the most traumatic thing that's ever happened to me, and I think to this day is. And so I remember, now I didn't come to the realization that my mom and brother were gone until sometime later. I think I was aware of it, but I don't think I had fully conceptualized the fact that they were gone. I even recall I never looked to my left to see the car seat and to see that my brother was missing from the car seat. I just was in so much shock, and whatever other worldly forces may have been there, I didn't even look. It wasn't even part of my view. But as I was crying, I remember my dad saying, "It's going to be okay, son." And for me, that was a bit of comfort, even if I didn't know the full situation and the full extent of the damage. But it did kind of calm me down, and it kind of makes me think about that. And I think, not to justify lying, but I think sometimes for a higher purpose, it's okay to lie. And that further, I don't think that necessarily was a lie. My dad may have said that and then retroactively thought that's a lie. But I think that, his, that may have been his, what you could have called his higher self, because it is okay. We're alive today. I wouldn't be the person I am if it wasn't for those happenings. And I think in some ways, not to justify it, but I'm a better, more realized human being than I would have been without having gone through that. I'm able to have more empathy. I'm able to kind of see outside of myself and understand where people are coming from. Just understand that people kind of have their own stories. They might seem like they're just a side character or just someone off to the edge of my movie. I'm the star, but everyone's a star in their own movie, and we all have our own stories and own events that have shaped us. And so I think that wasn't a lie. Things were going to be okay. They may not be great. They may not ever be the same, but we are okay.
Yeah.
So at that point, I remember the first responders coming, and they I remember being pulled out of the car like through a window. And then they gave me the basic rundown of, what's the alphabet, how many fingers am I holding up, what's your address, all that. And they kind of saw to me, and then they proceeded to get my dad. And I remember just being laying on the field off the side of the highway that they had put me on. And I remember looking over and seeing my mother kind of draped out the window, just her head leaning out of the window. And I remember seeing blood in her hair. And I still hadn't come to grips with what had happened at that point. But I think it was starting to, as resistant as I was, or just unawares or aloof to what was going on, that was kind of the beginning of knowing what had happened. But then they proceeded to, take us to the hospital. And I remember repeatedly I was vomiting blood. And I was just so shook up with all of it, and had no way to comprehend what was going on. And I remember even when we got to the hospital, at this point, that was the last thing my dad had said to me. There was no communication between us. And at that point, and further along our story, I just remember feeling so alone. And I realize now at this point in my life that I'm not alone. There's people who have gone through similar things. And it's when we're kind of in our darkest hour that we think we're alone. Even if we don't have someone immediately to reach out to, we're not alone, because we're humanity and we're all one, and we all go through grief, we all go through trauma, we all go through hard events. But I even remember being brought to that first hospital, and I could hear the screams of my dad from the other room. And I just didn't know what was going on. They weren't really, to my memory, weren't talking to me or telling me the shape of my dad, which was probably for the better, because if they would have told me the truth, that wouldn't have been a good thing to tell me that, it's not looking good for your dad. So I was just kind of alone by myself. And I remember, they put a catheter in me and kind of saw to me, and then they kind of left me in my own room. And I remember just falling asleep, kind of daydreaming and processing the events of the day. And I just couldn't fathom the fact that it was only hours ago that I had been in a park playing with my brother and there with my grandfather, and life was just so ordinary and yet so pleasant and so comforting. And now I was in this kind of hell. but there's memories that stand out to me of there was this really sweet nurse that for some reason I was so worried about my toys that I had lost. And I think it was kind of my way of not dealing with the real loss, but going to a more, not a spiritual loss, but just very more trivial loss of my toys. And she came back from her lunch break and had bought me a Star Wars figure, and that was awesome. And I'd even had some missionaries attend to me and give me a blessing. And so that, again, just kind of touched my heart to the love for our fellow human being that people showed to me, that was just so touching, and kind of smoothed the experience, or at least gave me some comfort of other strangers. From that point, at one point, they loaded us up and we got in a helicopter, the Life Flight, and they took us up to Salt Lake. And at that point, I still saw my dad, but he was just basically a carcass. He was just there. And I took that ride and we got landed. And I remember getting there, and it was just a grand reunion because finally I wasn't alone. My aunt and uncles showed up, my grandparents showed up, and they were there for me. But at the same time, my family was essentially gone. And so it was comforting, but there was still a bit of me that felt like I was alone. No one could truly know what I had gone through, and there was just no words to express that. And even going forward, I was in the hospital for about a week, and then I recovered. I remember it took me days to walk, and I thought that was kind of the funniest thing, that I had literally forgotten how to walk because I was just in a bed for so long, for 2 or 3 days. And so I kind of had to regain my steps, which is a perfect metaphor for tragedy in our lives. We kind of have to learn how to walk again, and kind of get ourselves situated and get ourselves grounded back in our lives. But I was there for a week, and then I moved in with my aunt and uncles, and they were so kind to me, and I'm still really close with that side of my family. It's my dad's brother and his kids. They're just amazing. But again, that theme of kind of feeling like I was alone. I was there surrounded by loved ones, being cared for, but I didn't really know how to communicate to others what had happened, and I didn't even really want to get into it, to be honest. That was part of my coping mechanism, is I just wanted to move on and get back to normalcy. And I remember even being in school and kids looking at my cast on my arm and saying, "What happened to your arm?" And I said, "Oh, I was in a car accident." And I remember one smart ass kid that was like, "Oh, well, the car must have just ran over your arm, huh?" And I was like, "No, well," and I didn't, what I actually said was just something just to kind of disregard it and move on. But what I wanted to say was like, no, like half my family died and my dad's still fighting for his life in the hospital. Like, how dare you? But how are you going to do that to a little kid and kind of shake their world? Because just as I couldn't come to grips with it, how am I going to put that on their shoulders as well and maybe traumatize them a little bit? But eventually, I was able to visit my dad in the hospital, and I had kind of vivid dreams of seeing my dad and kind of seeing the morbidity of it all and how in a bad shape he was. And I think they didn't even let me see him until he was more recovered, but I still remember having a few kind of reoccurring dreams of that. And I had reoccurring dreams of the accident as well. I think just trying to process what had happened, but they did haunt me for some time, maybe 6 months to a year. But eventually, I visited my dad a few times, and then eventually he was able to come back. And that was just a great time. And can I turn it over to you, Dad, now to kind of tell that side of the story? It feels a bit.
Oh yeah, no, that's and son, thank you. Two key things that you shared for me and maybe for others. But yeah, when I said it's going to be okay, well, gosh, here we are 25 years after the fact, and it's okay. So yeah, maybe I felt that it was a lie at the time, but Time is irrelevant. It feels so relevant because we live in this linear day to day, and we've done a lot of healing. In this process, and I'm going to go back to this profound goodbye where I'm telling my wife, I'll go back. I'll go raise our boy. I don't recall being extricated from the car. I don't recall any of the life flight. I don't recall any of that. All I knew is I had wrecked the car. I'd said the most profound goodbye I'd ever say. And then here I was wandering through the hospital. And as I say that, I was moving about the hospital. I was very much me, but I was very much aware of all the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the families of the patients. It's almost like I had a 360 awareness of everything. And everyone I saw, and Spencer, here's another key thing you brought up. You said, wow, these strangers, this nurse brought me a Star Wars toy, these people showed up and blessed me. I didn't know any of these people I was encountering in this life, but I knew them perfectly. In this 360 view and awareness and connection, I call it the oneness. I knew everything about them. I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their pain, their motivations, their decisions. I knew them as if they were me. I was them and they were me. Everyone I saw, everyone I encountered, I'll be very brief. I mean, this is one example, just one example of the many, but a nurse passed by me and she was completely unaware of me. But as she passed, I felt the very essence of who she is. And in that moment, I was aware, I knew, I felt it as if it was my own pain. I felt the abuse that she had experienced as a child, the physical, mental, sexual abuse. I felt it very real as if it had happened to me. But then in that same instant, I saw the magnificence of her soul. It's like, here's this beautiful person that's in a hospital serving, healing, working to care for others. And everyone I encountered, that's what it was. I saw the magnificence of who they truly are, beyond the body, beyond what happened, beyond any of these things. And there was an absolute connection that, like I say, the oneness. I was connected to all of them. They were me, I was them, and it was all held in this complete unconditional love. I mean, judgments and comparisons just went out the window until I finally came upon my own body, which was frightening because at first I didn't realize. It's like I saw this body laying on the gurney and I'm like, well, it's funny. I don't feel anything from that person. And I stepped closer to take a look. And that's when I realized, oh my goodness, that's me. But it wasn't me. I was having this profound connected experience, but there was my body and I knew I was to get back in it. And gosh, we have no idea how powerful choice is. I didn't have to figure out how am I getting back in. It was just, I'm going back in. And our thoughts are so powerful. As I had that thought and that commitment and that intention, boom, I was back in the body, but then back to all the pain, the grief, the guilt, of driving the car and losing control. It was so heavy. It was very, very difficult to be back in the body and all the pain and trauma and everything returned. As Spencer mentioned, I mean, I was an absolute mess. My stomach was all torn open and those wounds had to be left open and exposed for some time because of the infections having ruptured everything. The legs were crushed, everything. I was ventilated. They'd put a big tube down my neck to do the breathing for my lungs. My legs were obviously immobile. My right arm was immobile. It was nearly torn off. And they eventually tied down my left hand because I kept grabbing at all the medical equipment. And the hospital was very difficult. I was in the hospital for 5 months. I had 18 surgeries in total, putting me back together. But there was this commitment that I had made this promise. I was going to come back and raise this boy, and when Spencer was able to see me, it was incredible. He'd come in the hospital and I would just cry. And I know it was difficult for him because he didn't want me to cry. And I think so many of the family were further along in the grief process simply because they had each other. They were working with each other. They'd had a funeral. I was unconscious during all of that. I was in ICU, basically unconscious. But the most profound experience, and then we'll kind of move into the aftermath, may have happened at the end of my hospital stay. I had this profound out-of-body near-death experience at the time of the accident, the scene of the accident. And during those long months in the hospital, I felt as if I was in and out of the body a lot. There was times I felt I was standing in the corner watching my body. I just had to take a break. I had to get out of all that pain. There was intense times when I would feel again the nurse or the doctor would come in and I would feel the essence of their soul in a profound way. But at the end of my hospital stay, when I was out of ICU, I was out of surgical recovery, I was off of all the morphine, I was off of all the heavy narcotics, I was simply taking some Tylenol, and I was just weeks from going home. I was finally able to roll on my side. They had stabilized and they had stitched up and they had put a colostomy situation for me. And I was able to lay on my side without spilling my guts out. And I remember falling into a deep sleep. And in that sleep, I felt light come again. The light came, just like at the scene of the accident, and surrounded me. It felt like I was rising above the hospital bed. But this time, the light dispensed. It went away. It disappeared like fog going away. And I was in the most beautiful, incredible place. And I began to run. Now, gosh, I'd been an athlete all my life. I don't run now with one leg, and the one leg I have is crushed and all messed up. There's 6 pins and a plate, even holding it together. But in this experience, I was running, and I can't emphasize how physical it felt. I mean, I could feel the energy of the ground beneath my feet. I could feel the intelligence of my calves and my thighs. I was gleefully, joyfully running in this glorious, beautiful place. And, people say heaven or the spirit world or the other side. There's the only word I can use that even comes close to what I was experiencing is I was home. I was home. I felt so welcomed. It felt so familiar, and I was running. And then I got the message that I wasn't there to stay. And about that same time, there was this corridor off to my left, and I knew intuitively I'm to go that way. And I did. I began working my way down this corridor. And as I did, at the end of the corridor was a crib. Now, my youngest son, Griffin, was only 14 months old at the time of the accident. He was a toddler. He was still sleeping in a crib. And I had grieved so miserably his death along with my wife's death, but I had grieved so miserably him because in the accident, the car seat had broken apart and he had been ejected from the car. And that had just haunted me. And yet here was this crib. So I raced to this crib. And as I got to the crib, I looked in and there was my little boy. And he was perfect. He was sleeping peacefully. And he was very much alive. I swept him up. And I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child, but the heat and the weight of it, I picked him up. Everything felt so physical. In fact, I was even thinking, how can this be so physical when I know I'm out of the body? I'm in that different realm. But I held him next to me and I could feel his breath on my neck. I could feel his heart beating. I even leaned over and I smelled his hair because it's like, this is my little boy. This is him. It's really him. And I began to weep as I held him. And as I wept, I felt this intense presence coming up behind me. This overwhelming, powerful, cosmic presence that was moving closer and closer and closer. And I kept holding my son thinking, how can this be so real? Do I really get to say goodbye to him? And as this presence came so close, I grew up in a conservative Christian home, and I thought, that's God. that's God, and I'm in so much trouble. I thought my little boy is here. His life is cut short because I crashed the car. All this guilt and judgment was rising up. And as this presence came closer and closer and closer, I had the thought, I hope there's some way I can be forgiven. I hope there's some way I can be forgiven for this crash. And in that instant, and this almost felt physical too, as I had that thought, I hope I can be forgiven, these divine arms wrapped around and held me and my little boy. And there was just this download. The first communication, which it was beyond verbal. It was like every cell felt and heard and knew. I was told there's nothing to forgive. Everything is in perfect divine order. And then I had what is the life review. Suddenly I saw my childhood. I saw the divorce of my parents. I saw the insecurities that created in me. I saw my brothers and how they'd shown up for me. I saw the crash. I saw my life. And it was interesting because I kept saying, well, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. And this divine being that held me said, there are no mistakes. What did you learn from it? What did you learn? There was this beautiful presence that was showing me all these things. There was even things I said, well, I knew that was wrong and I did it anyway. And this beautiful being said, wrong? That's your judgment of it, not ours. We love you. You are as precious, and it felt like the whole universe held me. You are as precious to us as the child you hold. And of course, my little boy was divine and perfect and beloved to me. And that was magnified in this message that, that I was that beloved. And it was a very personal experience, but there was this ripple that I thought, gosh, if that's true of me, that's true of every living soul. There was so much love. There was so much peace. There was so much beauty. And I had grown up believing that life was a test. And this was my thought process. I failed the test. I crashed the car. Look at all this stuff I've done. And in these arms, what was so prevalent is that life is not a test. Life's an absolute gift. This whole question of what did you learn? How are you? Griffin, my son, was just learning to walk. He was just taking his first steps, and it felt as if the whole universe was saying, yes, you're all our toddlers. And yeah, you're down there slobbering and falling down and crawling and learning to walk, but you're learning to walk. We love you. We love you. And it was this resounding, I say we, almost the plurality of the entire universe shouting love. Unconditional love, no judgment. And then I learned about choice. And the being that held me, who I call God, said, you can be mad your whole life that this was allowed to happen, that this happened to you. And you can be mad at God your whole life, and that's okay. We love you anyway. And I was told you can choose to beat yourself up your whole life and feel guilty about what happened, and that's okay. We'll love you anyway. And then I was given a new choice. This beautiful being said, I want you to have your will in this. And I'm like, my will? I grew up thinking your will be done. That was the only idea, your will be done. And what was communicated to me was, your will is our will. That's how much we love you. Our will has always been that you have free will. You get to choose. And I was invited to give my son back. You can exercise your will. You can literally give your son back and he won't feel taken. You can exercise your will in the situation, and in all that love and in all that beauty and in all that peace. I kissed my little boy and I gave him back. I handed him over, and then I came back to the hospital bed. There I was with the amputation and I was such a sight. I mean, my left leg was cut off above the knee. My right leg was in a brace, sticking straight out because they had attempted to repair that knee. My right arm was in a sling. I had a colostomy bag and all the sutures up me. And yet I had this profound knowing that there was love, that there was order in it somehow, and that in a weird cosmic way that I had created it, that my soul had come to experience tragedy, to experience grief, to expand my heart some way. And that was just weeks before coming home. And I know Spencer was waiting, and he had seen me in the hospital, but he had been staying with my brother and his wife and his cousins. I mean, family can be a lot of different things. You can have blood family, you can have friends, you can have coworkers, but having people around you in tragedy that care and show up, it was incredible. My brothers were unbelievable to me. I have an older and younger brother. And Spencer stayed with my younger brother, and my older brother, who, he's almost been a father figure, because he became the man of the house when my parents divorced when I was young. They were both so supportive and so good that way. I mean, men, let's show up for each other that way. We could change the world. Women seem to have this intuitive nurturing, this compassion, this kindness, but if we could follow their lead as men and step up in the world and lock arms and say, hey, it's not going to be us and them, it's going to be we, and we're going to take a stand for love and take a stand for women and take a stand for right doing and right being, it could be a powerful thing. Spence, I don't know if you want to add anything, because I'm going to get into the story of me coming home and what happened, but if you want to add anything at this point, go ahead and chime in.
I was just waiting for you to get to the part where you arrived at Justin's house. So,
well, I'll get there, and then you can tell your experience, and we'll share it, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Well, it just feels a bit self-gratifying for me to tell that story.
I'll tell it, son. I'll tell it. And I was so worried about Spencer. Here's this little 7-year-old boy, and he had seen me in the hospital, and I was going to be coming home. And I've explained the state I was in. I was in a wheelchair. I couldn't walk. All I could do was drive the electric wheelchair with my one left hand. And that's the state I was coming home in. And I wasn't coming home. I still had to go to my brother's house, and they had set up a hospital bed in the extra room. I was having home health come in. I was still very ill and not well, but I was well enough to go home. And my brothers came and got me that day. And they had to literally lift me up. They'd have to pick me up and put me in the wheelchair. And then they were so good about, you drive it. We want you to get independent. You drive it. So I would drive the electric wheelchair, and they'd have to lift me into the car. And that was the state I was coming home in. And I was so concerned about Spencer, this 7-year-old boy. How was I going to be? I had been the rough and tumble father, and we'd run and played, and we were flying kites the day before the accident. And I was so concerned about him. And as the car arrived at my younger brother's house, and my brothers got out to put me in the wheelchair, I could see Spencer looking out the window. He's watching his uncles, these big, strong guys, pick up his dad and put me in the chair. And I thought, how is he going to deal with this? How's this going to be? There I was with one leg cut off, the other one in a brace, the colostomy bag hanging off my belly, the right arm in a sling. It was quite a sight. But as they got me in the chair and I began to go to the house, Spencer came running out the door, and he came running toward me. And my brothers put a ramp for me to get in the house with the wheelchair. He came down the ramp, he came running toward me, and he ran right past me. He ran right past, and I thought, it's too much. He can't deal with me like this here. In the hospital bed, I was all covered up, and that was different. And I thought, I'm just going to have to let him process this. And I began to make my way to the ramp, and I turned the chair to go up the ramp, and I just looked to see where he went. And he actually had run across the street, and then I began to hear him shouting. He was knocking on all the neighbors' doors, and he was saying, come out, my dad has made it home. Come see my dad. And I I burst into tears, and he did run, and he threw himself on my lap at that point, which just about killed me because I still had all the sutures and everything from the abdominal repair. And he threw his arms around me. And we had a funny conversation because I knew he was a Star Wars nut. And I said, look, they're going to get me a cool Darth Vader leg, and I'm going to work really hard to get well, but I'm going to be like this for a while. Are you going to be okay? And you can see Spencer's a grown man, but as that little 7-year-old boy, he said, Dad, if you were nothing but a puddle of blood, I would still love you. And I just burst into tears. And the reason I share this is a great place to kind of wrap up. I had a huge epiphany. There I was in a wheelchair, completely broken physically and emotionally, but holding my living son in this realm. Suddenly it was no less divine than holding my son who had passed in the other realm. It's like, heaven was right here. There was nowhere to go. There was nothing to become. It was simply to be in that perfect, precious moment. And feeling the unconditional love of my son, this child, was as powerful as feeling the unconditional love of what I call God. It was right here. And that was a huge learning that got me through it. It's like life is a gift. What am I learning in all this? And hey, I'm loved. I'm loved. And that heals everything. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. And we did heal. I mean, I did eventually get fit with a prosthetic. I was able to go to work. We were able to go back home. Gosh, I eventually fell in love again and remarried. And there's a whole, if my personal memoir, Knowing, it goes through all these things. I mean, gosh, I had dreams of my deceased wife. She literally brought Tanya, my current wife, into our lives. And there was profound and amazing things that happened. But at the end of the day, here was Spencer, this little boy who was growing up. He never had the near-death experience. He was navigating without it. I had these profound things which probably sustained me through the whole process. We've recently released a book, Spencer and I, and Spencer was the catalyst for this as he's healed and become a grown man. And I think when he fell in love and got married himself, he realized what we had lost in some ways. And we've written Where Are You?, which we set out as a children's book. Spencer said, I want all those little ones that don't have answers, that don't have a near-death experience. I mean, people, when we lose people we love in our culture, people would say, well, they've gone to a better place. And Spencer, as a boy, would say, how could it be a better place? My mom right here with me right now is the best place for her to be. There's no better place. And so we wrote this book and put it out there from the wounded, innocence of a 7-year-old who had gone through this loss without a near-death experience or anything like that happening. And anyway, we've been thrilled. It actually released and became an international bestseller, much to our surprise. We thought that grandma would buy a copy. We had no idea that it would be embraced like it is, but it's been a beautiful process and a healing process. And gosh, the near-death experience, what it's taught me is that there's nothing but love, that we're all divine, that life is a gift, and that there's perfection in everything, even in the tragedies, if we're just willing to look at it differently. And rather than asking, why me, ask, what am I learning? What can I gain? And I'm going to toss it back to you, Spence, to wrap us up and open it up for questions with this. I had all these answers in a near-death experience. Spencer navigated it somehow by sheer will and integrity and grief. And you don't get over. Grief is not something that you get over. You get used to it. But Spencer's navigated that in a profound way. Son, why don't you wrap us up?
Then.
Yeah, wrap us up. And
I'm not sure how much time do we have. I want to leave time. Anyways, so to catch us up, that grand reunion of me and my dad, we eventually moved back home. And I remember for a while there, I couldn't go into my brother's room. I just kind of avoided it. And it was just odd being with, just me and my dad and kind of in that empty house. But it took me a while to come to grips with what had happened. I recall many times my dad would try and talk to me about it, and I just didn't. I just wanted to move past it, and I didn't really fully deal with it. And for a while, I kind of leaned on my dad's experience. Eventually, he told me a little bit of what had happened, probably to the extent of what I could comprehend. But it was when I got older that I really started to kind of question things, and I just started, that frontal lobe developed, and I just started, asking questions and was wanting to find answers that I could really take a bite out of. And essentially, it's been through various seminars and just various modalities that I've studied that's kind of brought me to the place where I am. But for those who haven't had a near-death experience, there's a quote that kind of comes to mind that touches on my experience and is probably very similar to many people's experience, but I really quite like it. It goes, "Sometimes to find the light, we must first touch the darkness." And that came to me as we were both sharing. And I think that's how experiences like this are. Life before the accident was so perfect and yet so mundane because I didn't know anything else. That was just my waking existence. But after going through something like this, any mundane moment at home with my family, with my wife or with my family or my friends is a moment of light. And it's just sometimes, unfortunately, takes experiences like this to kind of bring that realization to the full light. But, eventually I found that, it's the little things that can bring us closer to our loved ones, or to bring us closer to that understanding that there's more to life, that we are divine sparks of divinity, and we are divine intelligence, and that we all have something to contribute. And where my dad may have more fully experienced that kind of hands-on, it's been through just going through life and being taught various things, and just I've studied mindfulness, and for that, mindfulness has kind of been able to bring me outside of myself and just be aware. Well, first, be aware of my own bodily functions, my own thoughts, my own sensations, and then from there being able to be aware of my sights and my sounds and other people's facial expressions, and just being able to reach out to other people and be more connected. But I don't know if I've given you a good answer of how I've gotten to where I am, but it's just been through walking day and day through life and coming to more of, I guess, kind of a just an understanding, just maybe help me out here, Dad. What's the word I'm looking for? It's just kind of an understanding that just comes through experience. It's more tangible. It's more analytical. I didn't have a divine experience, but I've just come to where I am through living and learning and understanding that we all are human beings, and we all have things that happen to us. And it's much better to come from a place of love and understanding, and treating each other as divine individuals, that makes life better, and we bring out the best in each other when we treat each other like that.
I love that, son. And I call it an awakening, but it doesn't, words are just words. They get in the way. It's an awakening. It's an awakening to what is. But, we can go into questions. One thing I admire about Spencer, and I always embarrass him when he joins me on these things, but at one point, when I'm talking of God and angelic visitations. And he's like, I didn't get any of that. He finally came to a place where he was a young man, and he said, you know what? Maybe I'll be God's love. Maybe I'll be God's light. Maybe I'll be God's hands. And he's like, this thing you call prayer. I don't know that door ever opened for me, but maybe I can be that here. And he was doing work with, after school rock and roll groups and having kids express themselves through music. And he showed up in a very practical way, where I might be the mystical one, but he's the practical one. And from my perspective, that is the most divine experience, Spence, is the one that is practical and works for everybody.
Well, I just want to say there's an experience I recall when we first moved back into that empty house by ourselves. And I remember waking up on many mornings and just hoping that had all been a dream, and I'd wake up and my mom and my brother would be there. But it never happened. But we got to pay attention to the little things, and I want to touch on this because that's a bit about what our book "Where Are You" touches on. But it's so true, especially for those of us who haven't had a near-death experience. We can rely on the stories that people tell of their experience, but it's not visceral for me. I didn't experience it. But what is just knowing that, there are those little things that we can pay attention to. I mean, even when I was a child, I was about the age of 14, and I had a dream that there was basically a vibe of a lot of judgment, kind of from a religious background, but I felt a lot of judgment put on me, and just that I wasn't good enough and I wasn't going to make it. But then through all of that shone my mom, and she came to me and basically said that she loves me and she'll always love me and she'll always be right here. And I told my dad about it when it had first happened and how miraculous it was. And then I forgot about it a week later and only recalled it later on in life. And I think it's those things that we can kind of think that we can justify away, and maybe we can, but if we pay attention to those things, they're not of no consequence. They have meaning, and I think it might be too easy if we just had really divine, just crazy experiences. But it's a little bit. I think you kind of learn to walk again, like I said, when you touch that darkness to know the light. You kind of build your own foundation rather than having it built for you. So pay attention to the little things. That would be my advice, and those little promptings that you have.
That's awesome, son. Thank you. And Helen, Chuck, we can open it up for questions. You can ask us anything. I know we're just coming up on the hour, but we're good for as long as we can stay and chat.